Another thing we thought might happen very quickly right after the election is that we thought the president might move very quickly to do something new and controversial while the election news was still hot, while election news was still dominating the headlines. So, among other things, the impact of his latest controversial move would be dulled, or at least muddied, by the election results. It's quite clear what that was. We saw in bright relief the intent of the president when he fired the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, the very morning after the midterm elections. He replaced him with a hand-picked replacement who is best known as an anti-Hillary Clinton, anti-Mueller investigation cable news pundit. The Justice Department is now being run by that new Trump appointee, Matt Whitaker. Today, the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel published a memo arguing that it was, in fact, legal for President Trump to appoint Matt Whitaker to be acting attorney general, even though that is a matter of considerable controversy, even in conservative legal circles. Today, the incoming Democratic chairman of key committees in Congress announced that they are already launching an investigation right now into Matt Whitaker's involvement in a sham Florida company that was essentially a long-running criminal fraud scheme. And I don't say that as an insult. I say that because the company has already been shut down by the Federal Trade Commission and was ordered to pay a $26 million settlement against these fraud claims from the federal government. Matt Whitaker, among other things, is believed to have defied that settlement to not pay back his own share of the proceeds from the fraud. He's also reported to have dodged a subpoena for his own records and communications with the company at the heart of the fraud. The Wall Street Journal has also reported that the scheme is now the subject of a criminal investigation by the FBI, which is particularly awkward since Trump has just installed Matt Whitaker to supervise the FBI. Matt Whitaker also reported in the Washington Post tonight to be considered a material witness in the FTC part of the case against this company that he's been involved with. He was considered to be a material witness, and the FTC, in their investigation of this firm, was apparently looking at Whitaker personally and specifically as to whether he had been involved in issuing legal threats to defrauded customers of this sham company who threatened to complain or make public their experience being ripped off by this firm with which Whitaker was associated. Matt Whitaker, of course, is also apparently supervising the Russia investigation now being carried out by Robert Mueller's special counsel office. Despite Whitaker's extensive public remarks criticizing that investigation, and despite his own close relationship with a key player in the Russia scandal, the Trump campaign national chairman, Sam Clovis, who hired and supervised both Carter Page and George Papadopoulos during the time period when their behavior attracted so much attention from the FBI and ultimately the special counsel. He was a campaign chairman for Sam Clovis, and Clovis still describes him as a friend. That sort of personal connection to that ongoing investigation would usually require the recusal of anybody at the Justice Department from overseeing that kind of investigation. Apparently, Matt Whitaker, at least as far as we know, does not see the need to recuse. Today in the Senate, outgoing Republican Senator Jeff Flake, whose Senate seat in Arizona was just won by Democrat Kyrsten Sinema, Senator Flake today once again pushed a bipartisan bill to try to protect special counsel Robert Mueller from getting fired. Republican Senate leadership quickly blocked the bill. Senator Flake then announced that his fellow Republicans can't count on his vote for any more judges or anything else until they pass the Protect Mueller bill.
I would like to take this opportunity to say a few words about what Special Counsel Mueller and his team have been investigating and why, as the point of this vital investigation seems to have been purposely confused and maligned by the White House in a rather alarming way. This bill is designed to do one thing: protect the integrity of the Special Counsel's investigation and spare it of any influence and interference from the executive branch, including from those who may themselves be the subjects of that investigation. This special counsel was appointed to thoroughly investigate the attacks on our electoral system by elements of the Russian government during the lead-up to our 2016 general election. One would think that there would be unanimous national resolve to get to the bottom of such aggression from an enemy foreign power. This is not a moment for our national leadership to be weak or irresolute or compromised in any way. But some of us in Washington have seemed strangely incurious about just what the Russian malefactors did to America in 2016 at the direction of Vladimir Putin. With the firing of the Attorney General, and in my view, the improper installation of an acting Attorney General who has not been subject to confirmation by this body, the President now has this investigation in his sights, and we all know it, on this unanimous consent request that has just failed today. Senator Coons and I are prepared to make it again and again until there is a vote on this vital bipartisan legislation on the Senate floor. And I have informed the Majority Leader that I will not vote to advance any of the 21 judicial nominees pending in the Judiciary Committee, or vote to confirm the 32 judges awaiting confirmation on the Senate floor until S. 2644 is brought to the full Senate for a vote.
Senator Jeff Flake saying he has told the Republican leadership they can't count on his vote for 53 different judicial nominees, either in the Judiciary Committee or on the floor of the Senate, until they vote on this bill to protect Mueller. Republican Senator Flake speaking late this afternoon on the floor of the Senate. He spoke alongside Democratic Senators Chris Coons and Cory Booker. Now, the Republican line up until now has been that there's no danger to the Mueller investigation whatsoever. So why would anybody take any steps to protect it? I mean, that's been the line. Now that the Attorney General has been pushed out and the Deputy Attorney General has been pushed aside and the President has instead installed his own guy to take over, it is hard to see how that Republican argument still holds about Mueller being totally safe and sound. But Senator Flake today was trying to push the issue to its limit on his way out the door in the U.S. Senate. So we will see what the Senate reaction is to Flake throwing down that gauntlet. That said, the other thing that we sort of expected to see happen right after the midterm elections is that we expected the Mueller investigation itself to spring back to life in a visible way. Justice Department rules discourage public action by prosecutors just before election time if those actions might be construed to have an effect on the elections. And so we saw almost no publicly observable actions from the special counsel's office at all in the lead up to last week's midterms. Well, now the midterms are over. Now that it's been a week, we're of course wondering if Matt Whitaker has already been able to delay or divert or flat out block any actions that Mueller's office might already otherwise have taken. How would we know? One of Mueller's prosecutors did appear in court last week after the election to argue a case before a federal appeals court where the plaintiff is trying to have Mueller's office shut down. Reporters who watch the federal courthouse in D.C., where the grand jury convenes that's being overseen by Mueller, those reporters say there has been plenty of activity in that grand jury room in recent weeks. And so leading up to the election, it did appear like Mueller's team was quite busy preparing something. What might it have been? Well, now tonight we've had another sign of life. A one-page sign of life from the special counsel. The president's deputy campaign chair, Rick Gates, is still out on bail right now, awaiting sentencing after he pled guilty to multiple felonies and entered into a cooperation agreement with the special counsel's office. While Gates continues to cooperate with prosecutors, his lawyers and Mueller's office, they periodically need to check in with the judge in his case to keep that judge apprised of their progress, basically, to let the judge know when Rick Gates's cooperation period might be coming to an end, when they're done with him, so the judge can go ahead and move forward with sentencing Rick Gates for his crimes. Well, that's where tonight's news comes in. The last time Robert Mueller's office and Rick Gates's lawyers had to check in with the judge in his case about his cooperation deal and how it was going and when they might be ready to finish his cooperation so they could move on with sentencing him, the last time they checked in before today was in August 10th. At that time, Mueller's office told the judge that Rick Gates continued to meet with the special counsel's office, that he continued to cooperate, and that they therefore were not ready to go ahead with sentencing him yet. They said specifically, quote, the investigation, which includes the possible continued need for assistance from the defendant, the investigation is ongoing. The investigation he is helping with is ongoing. And so they told the court back in August they'd need another 90 days with Rick Gates before they'd check in again. Well, that 90 days is now up. And now today, Mueller's office filed a new update with the court, about Rick Gates. And in the new update just filed, Mueller's office says they still are not ready to finish with Rick Gates. They've asked the court for another 60 days with him. They want to check in with the court about him again in mid-January. But this time, this is interesting. This time, they say the reason they need more time with him is because Rick Gates, quote, continues to cooperate with respect to several ongoing investigations. Oh, so 90 days ago, the investigation Rick Gates was helping them with was ongoing, the investigation. Now today, it's several investigations that he is helping them with, and they are all still ongoing. So we don't know what those investigations are that Rick Gates' cooperation is helping the special counsel with. We have no transparency at all as to whether the newly installed Trump loyalist at the top of the Justice Department is already messing with the special counsel investigation somehow, right? But today, the special counsel's office did pop its head above water to tell the court about its several ongoing investigations, and to tell the court that they expect to be working with one of their major cooperators at least into 2019.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.